Alright guys, welcome everybody to the second day of our seminar. Yesterday we had a presentation first by Gabriel Tupanamba and Dennis Yao. Today we're going to do the same thing, except that Dennis is going to go first and then Gabriel. The structure is a little bit different today, so we're going to have a presentation for 1 hour. And you're all going to be invited to write down any questions you have. After that we'll take a small break, do a second presentation. Second small break, and then there's going to be a third and final section where we're going to conclude and take both written questions and any further questions that come up. So without any further ado, here's Dennis. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this off for a second. Put this here. So I was thinking for today, I would kind of summarize the main point of the.
You gotta.
There we go. That's good.
I think you just gotta take it further.
Oh, nice. Okay. So I think what I'll do is kind of summarize the main, what I think are the main stakes of the first paper. And then I'll try to develop it from the perspective of a philosopher named Alain Badiou, who I think might provide a way to at least clarify some of the more complicated points in the first paper. So to summarize the last one, first let's write down some names. So I started with Lacan. And my basic idea that I was trying to present is that the notion of desire that is uncovered or investigated in psychoanalysis is somehow incompatible with what we normally call desire in the market space, or wants and needs, which are registered in the market. So that's the first point, which is that desire is not the same as wants. And the reason this is so is because the wants or needs are, they suppose that something natural, like a natural border between the human individual and the outside world, right? You want something not because somebody told you necessarily, but because it comes from somewhere inside, some source of preferences, for example. And I mean, economics as a discipline, kind of at least since the neoclassical period began, it's always been about starting from this basic assumption that human individuals have a set of preferences, and now what the job of the market is to register these preferences and respond to them, right? So the businesses can calculate, okay, the demand is going to be this much, so then we can put in a certain amount of money, invest to produce products that can then fulfill a pre-existing want, right, or need. But Lacan's conception of desire is not closed in the same sense. Rather, he says that desire is always the desire of the other, meaning that there's a point in which people don't know what they want, and they receive a certain conception of desire from the very language that is used to formulate desire, and that language is not something that they invented themselves, right? You don't invent your own language. You inherit a language. You inherit culture, and based on what you've inherited. So Lacan calls this, based on what you've inherited, which Lacan calls the symbolic. Let's write that down. Or use / language. So based on this thing you've inherited, you're able to formulate certain things and not formulate other things. in the last presentation afterwards, we did a brief example of this. Lacan tried to abstract this as much as he could in the 50s with the notion of the bicycle graph, which is how he depicted, given a random sequence of pluses and minuses, that you could, if you, let's say, group these sequences in a particular way, you would run into a situation where certain sequences could not occur, right? There would be a certain rule that you could not violate, even though the pluses and minuses are totally randomly distributed. So that's the idea, right? So with the symbolic, you not only get a means of formulating desires, like I want this or I want that, but you also get something constitutively or inherently impossible, right? So that's an offshoot of this impossibility. And I think the interplay between what you can formulate in the symbolic and what is somehow impossible or absent in what you say or what you say you want, the interplay between these two things is what characterizes desire for Lacan, right? And again, so this is something totally inherited, symbolic, and impossibility is something which it is also inherited, but it's also a bit different because you can, I mean, psychoanalysis is all about teaching someone basically how to deal with this impossibility in their own particular way. So if the symbolic in some sense is this very kind of neutral space that gets passed down to each individual, impossibility is something where there is a bit of, let's say, wiggle room for the individual to kind of navigate their way through the symbolic space. So that's just a very broad way of saying, like, you don't know why you were born and what you want, but there are some tools that you have that you can use to find your way. And so these 2 points here are very closely related, right? The reason desire is not a want is because this interplay is always there, basically. So one example of this that's relevant to the market, which I brought up in the last paper, is a quote by Todd McGowan, who is a very good scholar on Lacan. He says that in capitalism, we work really hard to buy things not really because they're useful to us, but because they're useless in some sense. And and he draws a connection to this notion of desire, which he says that the point of desire is that it wants to be sustained somehow. It wants to keep going. And if you get something useful, that doesn't really do the job. You need something, in fact, useless, something which is excessive in some sense, to keep desire moving, right? So let's put that there. So uselessness. Put down here. Although Lacan already kind of touched on this. I mean, he was talking for decades about the notion of desire. So many times he would bring up this fact of uselessness or excess as being constitutive of desire. But I think McGowan is the one who draws this very explicit connection to market. He has a really good book called
Enjoyment we don't have. Is it enjoyment that we don't have?
No, it's the psychic cost of markets. I think that's the subtitle. I forget the desire and capitalism and desire. I think. Yeah, just right there. So really, I mean, everything I'm saying here, you can find in some form in McGowan's book, at least this part of Lacan. So it's a really good resource if you want to know more about it. One more thing about uselessness. Another thing that McGowan says is that there's a certain secret enjoyment in the capitalist system that the market, or let's say the ideology of the market, wants to always hide from you, which is that, again, it fits with this, you don't buy things because they're useful, but because in some sense they're useless. And McGowan goes one step further from this and says that not only this, but people actually like to sacrifice their time and their bodies and their relationships. And the very act of sacrificing adds something extra to the act of consuming things, right? So if you were to just get something for free and you didn't have to pay something of yourself to get that thing, you would lose something that is essential to capitalism. So that's this very kind of an enigmatic aspect to the commodity itself, right? He draws a link between commodities and the notion of sacrifice or some kind of loss. Okay, so these 4 points here kind of cover everything I wanted to say about Lacan, at least all the concepts, I think. And with that, I wanted to use this framework of Lacan to go and read texts by Friedrich Hayek, who is one of the most important economists of our time. He basically gave the general framework of neoliberalism, in a sense, by using the metaphor of basically saying that the market functions something like an intelligent machine that self-regulates and is able to capture a specific aspect of knowledge and put it to use in a way that cannot be mimicked by central planning. So his whole critique of central planning is that, his name is Frederick Hayek, and his whole point with this critique of the market is that, the critique of central planning is that individuals all have a certain kind of knowledge that is very localized to their particular circumstances, their time and place. And when you try to abstract away from these specific situations, you end up losing that information. So, for example, if you imagine central planning, you're kind of trying to register in every neighborhood or every city the needs of that city, and then you come up with a plan every month or every year to produce X number of product because you know, like, they're going to need that much in this city. The problem is that that's very inflexible, right? Because something might change in a particular time and place. There might be a spike in population in one place. There might be unexpected illness or epidemic, and so central planning cannot adapt itself to this changing these changing situations, right? So it makes a lot of sense that the market as a decentralized system of price signals that this system of price signals is more adept at capturing this local situational knowledge, which is a very good argument that he develops, specifically in the text Use of Knowledge in Society, which is the one that I quote in the paper. So my argument is, in a nutshell, about his paper, about his text, is that, so he says that you're not allowed to generalize from specific times and places in central planning, because as soon as you do that, you lose information, right? Of course you're allowed to, but you'll lose something if you try to do that. But he ends his paper, near the end of his paper, he says something about how the market, we're able to treat the market as if it is a single line, right? And so that's where really the main thrust of my argument lies, which is why exactly does he use this metaphor? Why does he say that we can treat the market as a single mind when he just said that that's kind of like an inefficient and wrong way of approaching economics in general, right? If you try to approach it as if there's one master economist who's always figuring out what the price of everything should be, you're going to run into problems. So he creates this metaphor of a single mind, right? Single mind. And so I asked the question, okay, is this just a metaphor? If it is just a metaphor, then it doesn't seem to be very useful for him, because he just went through this whole exercise of describing how price signals are decentralized. I mean, it would make sense that it's what he's trying to enact is a kind of a shift in paradigm, right? You would say that something like multiple minds, right? Many minds working together in coordination. But he ends the paper by saying we can think of it as if it is a single mind. Okay, so I think that the argument I make here is that this is exactly what Lacan calls the function of the other. The other is something like the source of your desire, insofar as you're always, for psychoanalysis, anytime you speak, you are addressing someone. And depending on who you're addressing, it determines what can be heard in what you say. So that's the clinical definition of the other. But more generally, you could say that the other is always this point from which things become clear, right? It's a point you can refer to always that makes things clear for you. And I think a nice example is what Gabriel presented in his presentation from yesterday about the body of the king, right? When you see the king, you're not just seeing a stupid individual who just happened to be the king, but in some sense you see the state as a whole, right? The king embodies something about the whole. And my point is that isn't it also possible that for Hayek and for economists in general, the market functions kind of like a king, in the sense that it reflects back to you a certain vision of the entire world, basically, a certain unified vision. So yeah, that's my argument, basically, that it's not a metaphor that's at work here, but something real, something objective about the market. So objective, let's say, belief. There's something objective in Hayek's description of this unified mind. So that's kind of where I ended there. I mean, I didn't really develop it, and that's what I wanted to do today. The time I have left here. Let me. There's already someone who tried to develop this. It was Karl Marx, right? His idea was that capitalism functions because of a particular illusion, which he called commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism for Marx Commodity fetishism for Marx is defined as the state where relations between people manifest themselves as relations between things. And he makes a very important point that it's not something which you can just convince someone that it's not that case, right? You can't counterfactualize your way out of the space of commodity fetishism. So it's something objective, but it's also an illusion, something that you misrecognize in the social field. An example of this would be, just the most important example of this would be labor. So in the past, before capitalism, Marx says that you have something called direct relations of domination, meaning I own you, like I'm your master or whatever, and you work for me, you're my servant. And it's just a direct, like, two different people, two different classes of people, and it's a direct relation of domination. But what happens with capitalism? Now, everyone is free. No one dominates you directly, but there are situations where you are forced to sell your labor because you need a job to survive. So you go and get a job and you work for someone, and you don't really care what you're doing. And this is, you know, on some level it's fair because you're getting paid your share, right? You get paid. Marx never says like people don't get paid unfairly. His argument is not that people should be paid more necessarily, but that the very being forced into this relationship of wage labor is a continuation of the relations of domination. So labor on the market versus direct domination, right? Okay, so that's the core example I would use for commodity fetishism. It actually reflects back onto the master-slave or whatever relation, the lord and the servant relationship of pre-capitalist systems. So, okay, so Marx has already established that there's this kind of objective illusion happening, and it's kind of sustains capitalism. And so I wanted to today draw a link between that objective illusion and the one I just talked about with Hayek, right? Because they're not exactly the same. One is single price for every commodity, right? Single price for every commodity and single market, and also single mind. These three things, price, market, and mind, they're all unified. An example of the significance of single prices that I mentioned yesterday, imagine you find one commodity that has a price in one place and a price somewhere else. Well, because the market is unified, you can assume that there is a continuity between those prices. That this is the whole, the role of arbitrage, for example. Arbitrage is all about buying something in one place and finding someplace else where you can sell it. And that activity of like exploiting, let's say, exploiting the differential between prices is how prices kind of meet in the middle, right? Hypothetically. So prices are not discontinuous anymore. Prices are continuous, right? They're functions, basically, right? So a price here, say P2 and P1, even though they're discrete in reality, we can draw a continuous function that maps both of them. And so I think that is a good way to think about what it means to have a single price. It's not because there's one price for all commodities everywhere, for a particular commodity everywhere, but it's a single price in the sense of a continuous function of all prices, right? And again, that's treatable by mathematics. All of economics after the neoclassical, the marginal, utility, all economics becomes highly mathematized and uses these curves, indifference curves, for example, rely on this. There's a benefit to this, right? If we accept Hayek's premise of this single unified market, we're able to think the market with mathematical tools. But again, I think it requires a certain belief, a certain investment on the part of those who are in the market to accept this. Right? So the metaphor is not just a rhetorical device, but it's something which is actualized. It's a real aspect of how the market functions in the individual stock. So it's always trying to track how this thing fits into Lacan's conception of the other. Okay, so we have these two ideas of objective illusion. How do we square them? I think the best way to think of this is that there's one place in the market where this function is not really continuous, which is where it has to be somehow forced to be non-continuous, or forced to be continuous, sorry, but it's not naturally continuous, which is labor itself. Namely, when you buy labor, right, the whole point of getting someone to work for you is that you want to buy their labor at one price, so price of labor here, and then you want to use that labor so that the commodity you produce can be sold at a different price, right? Price of commodity. But these are two different, sorry, it's not a, let's say this is price and this is time, right? The whole goal of a business is to purchase commodities at one price, right down here, and to sell it up here, right? And sell a product up here. And this is the production process. It's no longer in circulation, right? Circulation, so there's two, let's say, distinct categories from Marx. Circulation is buying and selling things, just letting things kind of move around. Production is when you buy something and then you use it in a particular way, a creative way, to produce something new that never existed. And then reproduction is to take the thing that you produced and to just indefinitely reproduce it. But just focusing on the act of production itself, Marx's whole point is that there is a discontinuity between this one and this, let's say, buying and selling, right? Here. And his whole point is like, okay, what happens between here? He says that there's this gap here that is mysterious. No one ever really investigated where the profit comes from between this point and this point. Right, we can very clearly understand how the prices on the market of like gas, say gasoline for example, they can fluctuate and the price can be lower here and can be higher here. But how is it that I bought some things and without going somewhere else, without going to another location where these commodities, the prices of these commodities have changed, how can I produce something, how can my output be greater than that, right? And I'm sure you guys can already tell that he pinpoints this discontinuity in the very definition of labor itself. Labor is split between the cost of buying labor, right, the price of labor, and the product that is the result of labor. So the price of, let's say, product here, something like that. Okay, so there's some surplus here, something that's generated in this discontinuity. So I think that would be somewhere where Marx would fit in this notion of Hayek, right? Hayek says that there's this unified market, there's a single price, you can treat it as a single mind, but Marx points out that, okay, this unification of the market is supported by one thing which can't be unified. There's a, let's say, constitutive discontinuity which is the point between buying and selling labor. And that discontinuity is what allows for the continuity of all the other commodities in the market. So it's one particular gap. And that's where this point comes into play, right? Direct domination, commodity fetishism as relations between people are now reified into relations between things. So when you see the gasoline prices kind of fluctuating, you don't see the relations of production. You don't see people working and people being fired or people being hired in one place and outsourced to another. Right? Those disappear, and what you see actually are prices. So that's commodity fetishism. So now we can get to the part where we unify these two ideas, right? So Marx has this critique of Hayek, basically inherent with the concept of commodity fetishism, and again, it's an illusion that even if you were to tell someone how, we can clearly see how it works, but it doesn't change the fact of it happening. So there's a really nice quote by Zizek from his first book, Slavoj Zizek, where he basically outlines this logic. He says that Marx discovered the symptom, right, which is really weird because we think of the symptom as being something very personal, very like the symptoms on an individual body. But for Zizek and also for Lacan, Marx discovered a certain logic in the social field, right, in the very exchange relations between people. That logic is somehow the same as the logic that affects people's bodies, that makes someone's leg go numb or to make someone unable to say certain things. So he says here from Sublime Object, quote, "How then can we define the Marxian symptom? Marx invented the symptom by means of detecting a certain fissure, an asymmetry, a certain pathological imbalance which belies the universalism of the bourgeois rights and duties. This imbalance, far from announcing the imperfect realization of these universal principles, that is, an insufficiency to be abolished by further development, functions as their constitutive moment. The symptom is, strictly speaking, a particular element which subverts its own universal foundation, a species subverting its own genus. In this sense, we can say that the elementary Marxian procedure of criticism of ideology is already symptomatic. It consists of detecting a point of breakdown, heterogeneous to a given ideological field, and at the same time necessary for that field to achieve its closure, its accomplished form." So I think that's exactly what we're trying to track with this discontinuity of prices, right? There's a field of prices. It needs to have a certain closure. It needs to be a closed space, in the mathematical sense even, because in mathematics, closure means given some set of things, right? It can be the set of commodities, but it can also just be numbers. We can define an operation such that for any two things, like let's say if A and B are part of S, or let's say A and B belong to S, right? A star B, A combined with B will also be a part of S. A, B, right, mathematically. So for any two elements in our set of things, if we combine them, we get something that's also in the same set. That's closure. So we say that S is closed under this operation, right? And that's exactly what prices do, right? In some sense, given any two commodities, you can combine them through exchange, right? Or you can exchange one for the other, and you will get money, which is another element of S, right? Another thing that you can then exchange for something else. Actually, money plays a very important role because it allows this field to become universal in a very, very particular way, which is something that Marx tracks in Volume 1 of Capital. Okay, so this notion of closure, which we found in Zizek, we can also track it mathematically. And okay, so but what's important here? What's important is detecting the point of breakdown, which is heterogeneous to this field, and at the same time necessary for the field to achieve closure. So Marx identifies that as labor. Labor is that point which is a breakdown of this logic, because buying something at one point and selling at another, there's something in that middle point which is not itself part of this set of things that have prices. Okay, so all this is to say that so we have this objective illusion, and it's supported by something which can't really be counted, it can't really be seen. And I think this is where Badiou enters, because Badiou has a notion of appearance, which is objective, something which doesn't require anyone to really know what's happening in order for it to be effective. And the reason he's able to do that is because he says that appearances actually have real relationships with themselves, even if you're unable to see them. Yeah. So I think, there's many good examples, but I think probably the best one is if you think about music, whether or not you perceive the relationships between one note and another note in a given musical work, those relationships really exist because they're actually based on frequencies, right? They're based on real physical phenomena that are interacting in a particular way. So the idea of a relationship between, let's say, one note and another note in time, right? You can have, let's say, I don't know, different frequencies, and then over time, right? So you have like whatever. That might be one way of for us to take in music, but there's many different ways you can transform this, right? You can do like Fourier transform, where you actually see the different frequencies. I mean, that would be kind of necessary difficult to draw it out, but you can actually see like how much of each frequency there is within the sound. Right, so then frequency would be here, right? And then you get a different view of this, right? But we don't listen to music this way. We listen to it this way. But the point is that you can take this relationship and you can do transformations on it to reveal further information. And so because of that, we can say that it has some real relationships within that space of music. Then you can make changes to those real relations, which will actually change the overall composition. So I think this is a good example of an objective appearance, because you're taking something which people can have a subjective relationship to, but you're able to transform it into things that you have we can only think of, but we can't directly relate to. And I think this is a good way of conceiving of the market, right? The market is something that we experience every day in a particular way. We go there, we buy things, and we see prices and we see the fluctuation of prices. But at the same time, you can take that idea, that experience of buying and selling things, and you can transform it into another picture which can be experienced by anyone without loss of information. Like you don't lose anything by transforming it. And I think that's kind of where you can find Badiou's philosophy, because he actually develops a very general, a very broad system to analyze these appearances in a way that it doesn't really matter how you relate to these things. What you're trying to do, and maybe his formalism is wrong. Maybe he chose the wrong kind of mathematics, or he chose what his understanding of this mathematics is different, or could be improved upon. But his basic idea, I think, is in line with Marx and Lacan, in the sense that you can do this kind of operation on appearances. Okay. So I wanted to give one aspect of his formalization here, which is he posits that for any given appearance, things don't just appear by themselves, they always appear within a certain context, right? A very simple example that he gives is like a number, right? A number can be the page number of a book. It can also be someone's age. It can be the number of people outside the university walking through the campus right now. So you have a single thing called a number, right? Let's say 430. And you can have different, let's say, manifestations, right? You can have a book with page 430. You can have 430 students protesting. Right? You can have, I don't know, 430 degrees Kelvin. So there's something similar about 430 in all of these things, which is just the number itself. But in these different contexts, they mean totally different things. They're totally different forms of appearance. So from this basic insight, he tries to draw a connection between, okay, so what is this thing, 430 by itself, and what are these things, right? He groups them into two worlds, basically, right? One is called ontology, or being, which is a study of kind of like the study of the very existence of things, right? The very, not existence, but let's say the very difference, right? 430, the only thing that we can know about 430 is it's different from 431, 432, 433. It's different from, in an absolute sense. It's just not the same as those things. But here, if we say like 430 students protesting, and we add one more student, now there's 431 students protesting, we didn't really change things that much. In some sense, this appearance is very like adding one more doesn't really affect that. So he wants to kind of track that. Like, why is it that in let's say mathematics, for example, this number is totally different. If you get a result that comes up with a certain number and you're off by a little bit, you're totally off, right? It's they're either equal or they aren't. But here you have wiggle room. You have appearances which can be slightly different, but still remain coherent in the same way. Okay, so that's basic intuition. And he calls this world here, he calls it phenomenology, right? The phenomenological world, or the world of appearance. Right? So yeah, being and appearance. And his whole study is how these two things interact. And just to kind of jump into it, I think his whole stance is that we never know this. I mean, we do know this world in a very abstract way. We study mathematics, we study kind of like this kind of symbolic treatment of things, how things are different. But really, most of our knowledge that we get in the world, it's by this world, right? We only get two appearances. We study appearances, we learn from appearances, and from that, we can tell things about this world. Okay, the number 430 is kind of, it's hard to see this because once you know that 430 is after 429 and before 431, you kind of know almost everything there is to know about this number. I mean, unless you're a number theorist, then you probably come up with more facts about it. But let's say instead of this, we were to go back to the notion of value, for example, which is really important for Marx. So let's erase this. So what if you were to put the idea of value into this schema of values, and now you have different manifestations of this being, or this very absolute difference, right? So let's to pause for a second. When I say value, I mean something that differentiates commodities from each other. That is not the same as their physical properties, right? So if I have, for example, like two apples, one apple might be kind of rotten or whatever, and the other one might look good, but in some sense they have the same value because they're the same class of commodities. There's something that allows us to say that certain commodities are the same, even though they don't look the same at all. They don't act the same, right? A perfect example, I think, would be something like an education. An education is something that's very hard to quantify, but you actually you can put a price on it. And so you can say, in some sense, that an education has the same value in a naive way. You can say it has the same value as, let's say, a car or a house, right? I mean, in some cases, it's like a house, even though the two things are probably different. So that's kind of what I wanted to get to. Like, you have this thing called value, and then you have different manifestations in commodities. So you have, let's say, education, house, or like, let's say, cars or something, right? So you have the same thing, and then it appears in all these different commodities. And what is this logic that allows the same thing to appear in all these different places? I think that this is where really we get into the complicated part of Marx, and I think using Badiou's framework, we can investigate this. We can look at not value in itself, nor in the physical properties of commodities, but in the very going between one and the other, which, to finally go back to Hayek again, is, I think, the whole functioning of the single mind of the market. I think when Hayek says there's a single mind, so you can look at the market and you can see the whole, what you're basically saying is that there's a point of reference somewhere that I can look at these things, cars, house, education, and I can make sense of why they're the same. Why is a house kind of in the same vicinity as education in price? Because of this kind of more Platonic, let's say, this more Platonic notion of value. You can kind of find that point from which these things are the same, basically. And I think that's where we have this objective conclusion that, again, it's based on something which does not appear from Marx, which is the fact that labor can be consumed in the production process and you can get something extra, right? So this is kind of where I'm at as far as my research. I'm trying to understand how it is that, okay, you have these things and you can reflect, you can look at this point, which is the market, the unified, let's put a name to it, single market. And it somehow allows us to make this jump from these things back to value. So I wanted to track how is it that this changes when you add labor, right? Because again, Marx's whole point is that this commodity is different from all the other ones. When you include this into the sequence, this schema schema changes somehow. The single market is not enough to account for labor, because labor generates all these other ones, right? Every car that's made, every house that's made, and even your education is based on someone's work. So there's something discontinuous between labor and all the other commodities. And I think this is where, to go into it a little further, we can introduce the notion of what Badiou calls a transcendental of a world. Which is how he uses this kind of formalism to describe how things can be measured in a world. So given, let's say a world is something like this, right? And you have different points in this world. Badiou actually showed us exactly the same picture, right? When he was describing the transcendental. The transcendental is something like a measuring stick in the world that has a minimum, which he calls mu, and a maximum. And he says that for any two things in this world, you can figure out how similar or how different they are by mapping that identity into this line. So let's say this is A, B, or C, and you want to find how similar or how different these things are. You can always reflect them. So you can say that A and B are either minimally different, or sorry, that they have nothing in common, or they have everything in common, or they're somewhere in between. Right? This is the basic idea that he puts out. So in the case of the market, we can say, like, again, the example of apples, right? Apples, they're very similar, even though one might have some bruises, or one might be older than the other. They usually tend, if A and B are apples, two different apples, then they tend to have the same things in common, right? But there are other things which might not be, like let's just say the cost of hiring one type of worker versus the cost of hiring another type of worker. They might be totally different, even though maybe the work is not that different. Like if you go to a cheap restaurant, you're paying less for someone to make food, and you go to a really expensive restaurant and you pay a lot more, but the labor itself, the physical activity of making the food might be about the same amount of effort and time in one restaurant versus the other. So we should be careful not to say that this identity is determined by anything particularly like natural, right? It's not a natural relationship, like, because naturally the chef at a good restaurant is just better or works harder than the chef at a less expensive restaurant. It's because there is a certain there's the market forces, there's people's perceptions of the food that enable this mapping between the world of commodities and this transcendental measurement. Okay, so, and here's the really important part. Badiou says that we can make this measurement, we can analyze this measurement, because this measurement is not something subjective. It's not our preferences that make this, right? Normally, the economics is all based around the idea of subjective preferences. So their version of this would be to say that this line of maximum and minimum is inside of you somehow. Like you're the measuring stick for what is really what's similar and what's different in the world. So you might, I mean, that's the whole idea of an indifference curve, right? Indifference curve in economics is this idea that some quantity of one commodity and some quantity of another commodity are the same in utility for you. So you can draw a line between them and say that, you know, if I were to have, I don't know, 10 apples, it would be the same as having one phone. if you really love apples, having 10 apples,
If you really love it.
I could trade my smartphone for 10 apples, and I would be fine with it because I don't lose anything, right? And so it's totally subjective. I'm the measurement of this world of commodities. But Badiou says no, it's obviously not true because, and Marx says this as well, it's obviously not true because if that were true, then you wouldn't have this, you wouldn't have like prices which are calculated based on production, based on how long it takes to produce things, or you wouldn't have these phenomena that he tries to circumscribe in Capital, right? If it was all subjective, then this notion of surplus value, for example, the notion of making profit, wouldn't really make sense, right? Again, it's the idea that buying labor at one point and then selling the product, that whole thing means that there's something objective happening. There's something like you're literally creating a new product that has a different relationship and adds to this thing. So this measuring stick has to be objective. So the idea of design, I think this fits with all three of the thinkers that we're trying to track here. For Hayek, this schema shows us that the unity of the market can be formalized as something which is an objective illusion, let's say, something that we don't know it, but we're perpetuating something we don't ourselves need to be aware of to perpetuate. That's the, let's say, objective belief. And then for Lacan, we have this notion of desire of other, which is something like every time I desire something, it's always somehow inherited, right? You inherit the language used to formulate desire. You inherit a certain impossibility of things that you can't really say, and then you have to do something with that impossibility, right? Again, it's this objective thing. Your desire is not something that comes from inside, but something that you receive, and you need, every person gets this measurement from somewhere else, and they have to do something with that. And then finally, Marx, the idea of commodity fetishism, where he points out that even though there are no longer direct relations of domination anymore, you have these objective relationships which still basically produce the same end effect. Right? People are forced to sell their labor because of objective relationships between people, not because they're subjectively like, oh, I don't want a stable job because I want to explore different career opportunities, which is how it's sold to you usually. It's said oh, you get fired from this job, but that's okay because you can just find, it's always an opportunity to discover yourself somewhere else. But no, if you think about it, another way to put it is that we convince ourselves that this is somehow coming from us, that we are the ones that are evaluating things, and we prefer to work here versus there. But a lot of it is constrained, right? So, and then again, labor is very key for Marx here. Labor makes this whole thing run in a particular way, which is, another way of saying this is that this world is not the only world. The capitalist world of this transcendental that measures differences between things is only one particular way that we could think of this world. And so that's kind of where I leave off in my presentation, which is to think of, okay, and then Badiou has a lot of things to say about this, but what would it be to reintroduce a different idea of difference back into this world? What does it mean, actually, even more basic, what does it mean to change this relationship? world, right? If it's not a subjective thing, if it's not a matter of convincing people, hey, actually, you know, you should treat certain classes of people better than you treat them, even though they're homeless or whatever, they don't produce anything for society. You know, you could try to convince people that this is somehow, we should try to support them, but that's not as effective as changing the very measuring that's happening all the time. So I think this is kind of where I leave off on the idea of objective illusions.